questions for Mr. Zip, this is the moment. You're all satisfied.
Happy to answer any quick questions.
So I think one of the things you said was that one of the reasons for urban renewal is to stop the flight away from the city. So why would that be something that people are concerned about?
Well, can anyone hear me just like this? I can yell. I'm good at yelling. I yell at lots of classrooms like this. So in the late 1930s into the mid 1940s, during World War II, and just after, lots of people were concerned about the flight of population from central cities, and they were concerned particularly that cities would lose their middle class to onrushing suburbanization. We think of suburbanization as a kind of 1950s phenomenon, but it was really getting underway in the 1920s and 30s in mass, in sort of large forms, and everybody knew coming out of the Depression, going into World War II, as they prepared for what might happen as the war would come to a close, that there was going to be intense pressure on industry and on residents to leave the city. So one of the ways that they hoped to try to keep, frankly, capital and frankly, white people and frankly, middle-class people in the city from leaving the suburbs were these urban renewal policies. So there had already been these attempts to clear quote-unquote slums with public housing in the 1920s and up into particularly in the 1930s, and they were going to try to get that going again too in the late 1940s, which they do, and that's why I talk in this context about East Harlem so much. But they also wanted to try to attract private capital into the city to try to do some of this as well. And so that's why urban renewal had in part an idealistic kind of core at its heart, which was also, I think, in somewhat misguided ways of going about doing these things. But it did have this vision of trying to keep the city vibrant. So that's what I was trying to get at.
Sorry, I'm gonna continue. That's a really great preamble. I'm just going to turn it over to Oksana, and I'm actually going to introduce you in maybe an embarrassing way. So we have a project that's really obsessed with data, right? With data and with information, and kind of finding the information about our neighborhoods that is hidden away in all the different corners of our municipal bureaucracy, and getting that information to people in their neighborhoods where they can turn it into something actionable. Santiago is in the back. Santiago, will you wave? Santiago is a gardener at one of those green dots I pointed out to you guys earlier in the panorama. His green dot was actually a planned urban renewal open space that then remained a vacant lot full of rat bait for about 25 years. But now Santiago and his neighbors have gotten together and transformed it into something better. In order for us to be able to connect the dots on all of that, we actually have to do a lot of looking at spreadsheets and shapefiles and just sitting at the computer and just burning through it. And Oksana was our first sort of heroic volunteer and then a first employee to just do that. Just look at every single parcel that the city had in their inventory and see and try to figure out what it meant. So it's really awesome to be continuing to work with you, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to you.
Thanks so much for everyone for being here. And I really don't need to say anything more besides what Paula said before and what Mariana and Jennifer are going to talk about in just a second. So I'm just going to turn it over to them.
I'm going to, I think, try to go mic-less as well. And I'll introduce myself, and then Jennifer was going to talk a little bit about give us a little bit of background for these films before we get started.
I think you guys either need to face dead front.
I won't talk to the screen. Anyway, we'll have a lot more time to sort of talk about the films, urban renewal at this time, questions that it raises after the film. But anyway, I'm Mariana Mogilevich. I'm a historian. Study architecture and urbanism in the U.S. after World War II. So I've done a lot of work on sort of rethinking the city, urban design and planning in New York in the 60s and 70s, and wrote a little piece for the Urban Reviewer website, sort of looking at the long durée, let's say, of urban renewal in New York. We're really lucky to have Jennifer Hock join us today from Washington, D.C. She is a really fantastic also a historian of architecture and urbanism who's done a lot of work on the history of urban renewal and especially sort of grassroots resistance and reaction to urban renewal in New York and in New Haven and in Boston. She's really the expert on this moment and on these films. So she's going to set the stage for us, and we can kind of sort of dive into them more deeply after we've seen the two films. So.
Great. I just want to say thank you, Mariana, for the introduction. Thank you to Oksana, to Paula, and to everybody for being here. I think there is a younger generation of scholars who are trying to make something of what happened during the years of the 50s and the 60s and early 70s, just as there are community activists today dealing with the actual kind of spatial and physical ramifications of the urban renewal program. I made a couple of notes while we were listening to Sandy, who kind of took us from the 40s into the 50s, and I just want to say a couple words about what we're going to see in the films today, taking us from the 50s in through the 60s. And I wanted to start off with this notion that protest is absolutely integral to urban development. Every time there's a change in the city, there are winners and there are losers. There are people who benefit, there are people who are pushed out of the neighborhood or who are forced to change their ways in some sort of fashion. And because things like urban renewal often promise very powerful public good, that is economic development, better housing, better transportation, often plans to change the city have very powerful supporters. You can think both of the official folks, that is the kind of city planning commission, the city government, but also unofficially power brokers within the city, people who are invested in the long-term fate of New York. And so as I say that, I want to kind of bring up this issue of if there's a plan in play, if, as Sandy argued, there's this kind of notion that planning might be good for us and that we might need to make some sacrifices along the way, what do you do if you are one of those small business people whose entire livelihood is dependent on a particular location in New York that has been condemned by an urban renewal plan? What do you do if you're a tenant who doesn't have the means to move or who faces being pushed out of a part of a city or into another borough you've never seen before? So I just want to bring up this issue. There are enormous forces on the side of change. Even though the US doesn't have a particularly strong planning program, during the 50s, the 60s, there was kind of the sentiment of public opinion that there was something about the post-war modern world that required strong intervention and large-scale change. There were powerful allies who backed urban renewal plans, as we saw in the case of some of Sandy's projects. And there's actually this legal principle of eminent domain. There is an established right of the government to condemn specific parcels of land for public good. Well, there's a big jump between condemning a lot for a new school and condemning an entire neighborhood, right? But this issue actually went all the way to the Supreme Court in 1954 in a case called Berman versus Parker, and the Supreme Court ruled that local governments could indeed condemn entire neighborhoods for larger intangible benefits such as aesthetics and economic development. Those are powerful forces to work against. And so we start seeing there have always been protesters against urban renewal plans, people who don't want to move, people who face kind of a certain kind of dispossession, who face losing their businesses. They band together over and over through the 50s and through the 60s, and it's really only in the 1960s, as the nation as a whole gets a little bit more radical, as people kind of reading the newspaper, watching TV at night, start to see the civil rights movement, they start to sort of see this vocabulary about the rights of people, this kind of public debate about what qualifies as equity in the city. Are we really a democratic society? As a new left rises, there's suddenly even more powerful arguments against urban renewal than there have been before. And so we're going to see some of these powerful arguments, both the kind of neighborhood-based argument that Sandy referred to earlier, this notion that maybe we're actually losing more than we're gaining when an older neighborhood with a kind of vibrant local economy is destroyed. Maybe it's not just that, maybe there are larger arguments about kind of structural issues in US society. Maybe urban renewal is a microcosm of some of the faults of the US state and a kind of microcosm of the power play between ordinary people and people of privilege and power. So the two films we're going to see today, there's a very short film called The Case Against Lincoln Center, filmed in 1968, and a longer film I'm going to need a Spanish speaker to help me out here. Rompiendo Puertas, also known as Break and Enter, filmed in 1970, released in 1971, that was made by a group called Newsreel, which then became Third World Newsreel in the couple of years after this. Newsreel was a collective of filmmakers in New York City, with chapters throughout the US later, that had been radicalized by the mainstream news coverage of the March on the Pentagon in 1967. It was a peaceful march that suddenly was oppressed in a very brutal way by the police, and a number of young New Left radicals and a number of urban activists took a look at that and said that's not an example of, that's not the right message that's being conveyed. We want to form this collective in order to get out a more accurate representation of what's actually happening to people in ordinary neighborhoods across the US. And so Newsreel came together, and you'll see on these two things there's no sort of kind of a list of credits or a director here. It's a collective under this kind of Newsreel rubric. And they're trying to tell the stories of ordinary people. They do a number of different short newsreels in the late 60s, a number of longer films, and they're trying very hard to get the stories of ordinary people out. Originally, they were led by middle-class white male activists, who were the people who initially had power within the kind of world of alternative media and alternative film. But as the 60s went on and into the 70s, they became increasingly concerned with focusing on what they dealt as kind of the third world rubric. How to deal with the issues of people of color, how to deal with the issues of the poor, and how to make a connection between the problems that poor people and people of color have in New York City and some larger issues in the world in general. I think this is the kind of period of Vietnam, I think of some of the political protests going on. So these films today are made in this kind of, they're made in a very, I'm just going to tell you that they have deliberately poor production values. They're a little hard to watch.